Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Today we're diving into a really fascinating one.
We are.
The Ascent of Money by Niall Ferguson.
Yeah, this one
Of financial history.
it's a big one.
It is. It's a big topic and it's a dense book.
Yeah, so we're going to try and break this down, make it a little bit more manageable for everyone.
Yeah, and this is going to be a multi-part deep dive because
Yep.
there's just so much in here.
So much to talk about.
Where
So,
do we even begin with this?
first of all, I think it's important to just kind of like lay out what Ferguson is trying to do in this book.
Okay.
And he's really trying to argue that financial history is essential to understanding human progress.
Okay.
He kind of challenges this idea that financiers are just kind of these like leeches or, these villains that are just kind of like siphoning off wealth from the rest of society.
They're just greedy.
He's saying, no, actually, financial innovation is absolutely crucial to how we've gotten to where we are today.
And that's a pretty provocative argument, I think.
It is interesting.
And he makes a pretty compelling case for it.
Yeah, I think so too. It's interesting because, you think about history and you think about wars and you think about all these other things.
Right.
But you don't necessarily think about the financial systems that were underlining all of those events.
Right, and that's what Ferguson does so well is he connects all of these seemingly disparate events like wars, revolutions, technological innovations,
Yeah.
and he shows how finance is kind of this underlying thread
Right.
that connects them all.
It's almost like the invisible hand that's guiding everything.
Exactly, and it's something that we often overlook, but it's so important.
Yeah. So, okay. So we've kind of laid out his argument.
Yeah.
What are some of the key themes that he explores in this book? What are some of the things that listeners should be kind of prepared for?
Well, so one of the core things is this evolution of money itself.
Okay.
Right? So he takes us from, tangible assets like gold and silver, all the way to, these increasingly abstract forms like, paper money, and then eventually like, the digital currencies that we see today.
Right. The ones and zeros that are floating around.
Exactly. And he shows how this evolution has really shaped the way that we think about value and the way that we interact with the world.
And the way that the world interacts with us. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, it's almost like money has become more and more divorced from any kind of physical reality.
It really has. It's become this kind of like this abstract concept.
Yeah, it's just an idea.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating to think about.
It is, especially when you consider how much of our lives revolve around it.
Right, like our entire world is built on this system of finance that is ultimately based on this kind of like shared belief in this abstract concept.
Right, and it's a concept that's constantly evolving.
It is, and that's another thing that Ferguson highlights. So much of human progress.
Right, so we're always trying to find new ways to, create value, to store value, to exchange value.
Exactly. And that leads to all sorts of interesting developments like, the creation of banks,
Right.
the development of stock markets, the rise of insurance companies.
All these things that we kind of take for granted now.
Yeah, they all had to be invented at some point.
Right. It's almost like a never-ending story of human ingenuity.
It really is. It's this fascinating interplay between, creativity, risk-taking, and this desire for profit.
Right. And sometimes those things can lead to some pretty disastrous consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Ferguson doesn't shy away from talking about the dark side of finance either.
Yeah, the bubbles, the crashes, the times when things go horribly wrong.
Right, and he shows how these crises are often the result of, excessive greed, speculation, lack of regulation, all of these things that can kind of like distort the system.
And lead to those boom and bust cycles that we see throughout history.
Exactly. And he argues that understanding these cycles is essential to understanding finance itself.
Right, because it's not just a straight line upwards.
It's not. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah, with lots of twists and turns.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Okay, so we've kind of gotten a sense of the scope of the book.
Yeah.
Where does Ferguson actually begin this grand narrative? Like, where does he take us first on this journey?
So he actually starts by taking us all the way back to the very origins of money.
Okay.
Like, how did we even get to this point where we have this abstract concept of money?
Right. Like, how did we go from, trading chickens for wheat?
Exactly. He examines how early civilizations transitioned from barter systems to using, precious metals like gold and silver as mediums of exchange.
Right.
He even delves into some really interesting stories like, the use of cowrie shells as currency in parts of Africa and Asia.
Cowrie shells.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just like a little seashell,
And
right? How did that become money?
Well, it's fascinating because it shows how even seemingly ordinary objects can take on extraordinary value when people agree that they have worth.
So it's all about a shared belief.
Exactly.
It's like a collective delusion almost.
Well, in a way, yes.
But it's a delusion that we all kind of buy into.
We do, and that's what makes money so powerful.
Okay, so we've got cowrie shells, we've got gold, we've got this budding understanding of shared belief.
Right.
What's the next step in this financial evolution?
Well, so Ferguson takes us to ancient Mesopotamia, where we see the emergence of early forms of banking and credit.
So banking has been around for a long time.
It has, and it's fascinating to see how these practices developed.
What were they doing back then? I mean, were they like writing loans on clay tablets or something?
Actually, yeah, they were.
No way.
Archaeologists have unearthed these clay tablets that reveal these sophisticated systems of loans interest rates.
Oh, wow.
Even debt forgiveness.
So they were dealing with the same kinds of financial issues that we are today.
In many ways, yes.
That's incredible.
It is, and it shows that these financial practices have roots that stretch back thousands of years.
So it's not just something that Wall Street invented.
No, not at all.
It's something that's been woven into the fabric of human civilization from the very beginning.
Exactly, and Ferguson does a great job of highlighting those connections.
Okay, so we've gone from cowrie shells to clay tablets, from barter to banking. What's next in our journey through the ascent of money?
Well, next, Ferguson takes us to the world of ancient Greece.
Okay.
And specifically the Athenian Empire.
The birthplace of democracy.
Exactly. And they were also incredibly innovative when it came to finance. They developed sophisticated coinage systems, they established public banks, and they even financed large-scale infrastructure projects through public debt.
Public debt in ancient Greece.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about.
It is. It sounds like they were grappling with some of the same financial challenges that we face today.
They were, and their successes and failures offer some really valuable lessons about the power and the perils of public finance.
So what happened? Did they manage their debt well, or did things kind of go off the rails?
Well, Ferguson highlights how Athenian ingenuity and financial savvy really fueled their rise to power.
Okay.
But he also shows how mismanagement and overspending contributed to their eventual decline.
Ah, so it's a cautionary tale.
It is a classic tale of hubris and the dangers of overreaching.
And it's a tale that's been repeated many times throughout history.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got ancient Mesopotamia, we got ancient Greece. We're starting to see some of the building blocks of modern finance coming together.
Yeah, the foundations are being laid.
Where does Ferguson take us next?
Well, from there, we move into the Roman Empire, which, of course, was a vast and complex empire with its own unique set of financial challenges.
Right. I mean, they had to manage all those legions, all those roads, all those public works projects.
Exactly. And they developed some pretty ingenious ways of doing it.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, they had a very sophisticated system of taxation.
Yeah.
They also developed a fairly advanced form of coinage. And they even experimented with early forms of paper money.
Paper money in ancient Rome.
It's true. They had these things called syngraphae, which were basically like promissory notes.
Wow.
That could be used to transfer funds between individuals.
So they were kind of like early checks?
Yeah, in a way.
That's fascinating.
It is, and it shows that the Romans were really pushing the boundaries of financial innovation.
But of course, the Roman Empire eventually collapsed.
It did, and Ferguson argues that financial mismanagement played a role in its decline.
So even the mighty Roman Empire couldn't escape the perils of bad financial decisions.
Apparently not.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already.
We've gone from cowrie shells to ancient empires.
From barter to banking to public debt.
It's been quite a journey.
And it's only just begun.
That's right. We've still got centuries of financial history to explore.
I can't wait.
Me neither.
Okay, so stay tuned, folks. We'll be back in the next part of this deep dive to delve even deeper into the fascinating world of the ascent of money.
And we'll see how these early developments paved the way for the modern financial system that we know today.
It's going to be a wild ride.
It always is with finance.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so until next time.
Keep those wallets closed.
And those minds open.
See you later.
Bye. So last time we left off talking about the Roman Empire.
Yeah, and kind of like the beginnings of...
The seeds of modern finance, right?
Yeah.
We talked about early forms of banking and coinage and even like, those promissory notes.
Yeah.
The Singerfay.
What were they called?
Singerfay.
Singerfay. Okay.
Which were kind of like early checks.
Right. So what happens next?
So after the Roman Empire falls,
Mm-hmm.
Europe kind of enters into this period that we call the Middle Ages.
Okay.
And for a long time, finance kind of takes a back seat.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's still there. But it's not as prominent as it was during the Roman era.
Why not?
Well, for a few reasons.
Okay.
One is that, Europe is kind of fragmented at this point.
Right. It's not a unified empire anymore.
Exactly. You've got all these different kingdoms and principalities,
Mhm.
and trade is much more localized.
So there's not as much need for sophisticated financial systems.
Right. And the Catholic Church, which is a very powerful force at this time,
Mm.
is also pretty hostile towards things like usury.
Usury, which is like charging interest on loans.
Exactly. And so that kind of puts a damper on financial innovation for a while.
Interesting. So finance is kind of in this like holding pattern during the Middle Ages.
Yeah, pretty much.
But
But then things start to change around the 11th and 12th centuries.
okay, what happens?
Well, you start to see a revival of trade.
Okay.
Cities begin to grow again,
Mhm.
and there's just this general increase in economic activity.
So there's more demand for money.
Exactly. And that leads to a resurgence of financial innovation. Well, one of the big developments is the rise of Italian banking families like the Medicis.
Ah, the Medicis.
Yeah, they were like the rock stars of Renaissance finance.
I mean, they were incredibly wealthy and powerful, weren't they?
They basically bankrolled the Renaissance.
It's amazing how they were able to wield so much influence.
Well, they were incredibly shrewd businessmen,
Okay.
and they had a really good understanding of how to use finance to their advantage.
Like how?
Well, for one thing, they developed a vast network of branches across Europe,
Okay.
which allowed them to transfer funds quickly and efficiently.
So they were kind of like the Western Union of their day.
Yeah, kind of.
Interesting.
They also pioneered new financial instruments like bills of exchange.
Bills of exchange.
Yeah, they were basically like early checks.
Yeah.
They allowed merchants to make payments without having to transport large amounts of physical gold or silver.
So that made trade a lot easier and safer.
Exactly. And it also helped to reduce the risk of theft and piracy.
Right, because you're not carrying around all that gold.
Exactly.
So the Medicis were really instrumental in shaping the financial landscape of the Renaissance.
They were pioneers in many ways.
And their influence extended beyond just finance. Right.
Oh, absolutely. They were also major patrons of the arts.
Right. They funded all sorts of amazing artists and thinkers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They helped to make Florence the cultural center of the Renaissance.
It's incredible to think how much influence they had.
It is, and it really shows how finance can be a powerful force for shaping society.
Okay, so we've got the Medicis and their bills of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
What other financial innovations were happening during this time?
Well, another big development was the emergence of stock exchanges.
Stock exchanges, now we're talking.
Yeah, this is where things start to get really interesting.
So where did the first stock exchanges pop up?
Well, the first one that we know of was in Antwerp.
Antwerp.
Yeah, in Belgium.
Okay.
It was established in the 16th century.
And what were they trading on this stock exchange?
Well, at first it was mostly government bonds, but then they started trading shares in joint stock companies.
Joint stock companies, so like the Dutch East India Company?
Exactly.
Those were like the mega corporations of their day, weren't they?
They were massive enterprises that were involved in all sorts of global trade.
And they needed a lot of capital to fund their operations.
Exactly. And that's where the stock exchange came in.
So instead of just relying on a few wealthy investors,
Right.
they could sell shares to the public.
Exactly. And that allowed them to raise vast sums of money,
And it also allowed ordinary people to invest in these ventures.
which was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time.
It is. It's like the democratization of finance.
Exactly. And it had a huge impact on the development of capitalism.
Okay, so we've got banking families, we've got stock exchanges. What else is happening in the world of finance during this time?
Well, another big development is the rise of insurance.
Insurance? Okay, so how did that come about?
Well, it actually has its roots in ancient maritime trade. Merchants were always looking for ways to mitigate the risks of shipping goods across the sea.
Right, because ships could sink or be attacked by pirates.
Exactly. And so they developed these early forms of insurance where they would basically pool their resources together.
Mm-hmm.
And if one of their ships went down, everyone would contribute to cover the losses.
So it's like a mutual aid society.
Yeah, kind of.
And how did that evolve into the modern insurance industry that we know today?
Well, over time, these insurance practices became more formalized,
Okay.
and specialized insurance companies began to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
They started offering insurance for all sorts of things, not just maritime trade.
Like what?
Well, fire insurance was a big one,
Okay.
and life insurance also started to become popular.
Interesting.
And as these insurance companies grew, they started to accumulate a lot of capital, which they then invested in other businesses.
So they became major players in the financial system.
Exactly, and they still are today.
It's amazing to think how all of these different pieces of the financial puzzle were coming together during this time.
It really is. It was a period of incredible innovation and transformation.
And it laid the groundwork for the modern financial world that we know today.
Absolutely. So we've journeyed through centuries of financial history, from those cowrie cells to the mighty Medicis and those first stock exchanges.
Yeah, it's amazing how finance has always been this, like, driving force, shaping civilizations and empires.
It really is like this hidden hand guiding the course of history.
Exactly. So where does Ferguson take us as we move into the 20th century?
Well, the 20th century is really where things get really interesting.
Okay, why is that?
Well, for one thing, it's the century of globalization.
Right, like the world becomes increasingly interconnected.
Exactly, and finance plays a huge role in that process.
Okay, so how does that play out?
Well, for one thing, you see the rise of these massive multinational corporations.
Right, companies that operate in multiple countries.
Exactly, and they need sophisticated financial systems to manage their global operations.
So what kind of systems are we talking about?
Well, you see the development of things like international banking,
Okay.
foreign exchange markets, and, of course, the stock market becomes increasingly globalized as well.
So it's like finance is becoming this like global web connecting everything.
It really is, and that has all sorts of implications, both good and bad.
Right. I mean, it can lead to greater economic growth,
Exactly.
but it also makes the system more vulnerable to shocks.
Absolutely, and we see that play out in a number of ways throughout the 20th century.
Like with the Great Depression.
Exactly. The Great Depression is this like massive global financial crisis that really highlights the interconnectedness of the world economy.
Yeah, because it starts in the U.S.
Right.
But then it spreads like wildfire to Europe and the rest of the world.
Exactly, and it has devastating consequences everywhere.
It's like a wake-up call.
It forces people to rethink the way that they manage the global financial system.
And what kind of changes come out of that?
Well, you see the creation of things like the International Monetary Fund,
Okay.
the World Bank. These institutions are designed to try to stabilize the global economy and prevent future crises.
So it's like an attempt to kind of like put some guardrails on globalization?
Exactly. And then, of course, you have World War II.
Right, which obviously has a huge impact on the global economy as well.
Absolutely. I mean, the war destroys a lot of infrastructure. It disrupts trade, but it also leads to some interesting financial innovations.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, you see the development of new ways to finance the war effort,
Okay.
like war bonds.
Right.
You also see the rise of things like the Bretton Woods system.
The Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, this was an agreement among the Allied nations to create a new international monetary system after the war.
Okay, so it's kind of like a reset for the global financial system.
Exactly. And it's a system that's based on the U.S. dollar.
Interesting.
The dollar becomes the world's reserve currency.
So that gives the U.S. a lot of power and influence.
It does, and that power shapes the global economy for decades to come.
Okay, so the war ends.
Right.
The Bretton Woods system is put in place.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next in this financial saga?
Well, you have this period of rapid economic growth in the developed world.
Okay.
This is the post-war boom. People are rebuilding their lives. They're consuming more.
Yeah?
And that leads to this surge in economic activity.
So it's a good time to be alive.
For many people, yes.
But there are always challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, you have the Cold War.
Right, the ideological battle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And that has all sorts of implications for the global financial system.
Okay.
You also have the rise of new economic powers like Japan and Germany. They're challenging the dominance of the U.S.
So the global balance of power is shifting again.
It is. And that creates all sorts of tensions and uncertainties.
So it's a complex and dynamic period.
It really is. And Ferguson does a great job of capturing all of the nuances of this era.
Okay, so we're getting closer to the present day now.
We are.
What are some of the key developments in the latter part of the 20th century?
Well, one of the big things is the rise of computers.
Ah, the digital revolution.
No, exactly. And computers have a profound impact on finance.
How so?
Well, they make it possible to process information much faster,
Okay.
to execute trades more quickly,
Hmm.
and to create all sorts of new financial instruments.
So it's like finance is being supercharged by technology,
Exactly, and that leads to a lot of innovation.
but also a lot of risk, right?
Absolutely, because with greater speed and complexity comes greater potential for things to go wrong.
And we see that play out in a number of financial crises in the late 20th century.
Right, you have the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s,
Right.
and then, of course, the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s.
So it's like these cycles of boom and bust are still happening.
They are, and Ferguson argues that they're an inherent part of the financial system.
So there's no way to completely eliminate risk.
Not really. I mean, you can try to mitigate it,
Okay.
but you can never completely eliminate it.
So what's the takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think Ferguson's main point is that financial history is essential to understanding the world that we live in today.
Okay.
He argues that finance has been this driving force behind so much of human progress.
Right, but it's also been a source of a lot of instability and suffering.
Absolutely. And so it's important to be aware of both the good and the bad.
To understand the risks as well as the rewards.
Exactly. And to learn from the mistakes of the past.
So we can make better decisions in the future.
Exactly.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Ascent of Money.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, remember,
The Ascent of Money is a journey that we're all on together.
so buckle up and enjoy the ride.
See you next time.
Bye!